right, buckle up because there's a seriously cool new city builder hitting Steam this year, and it's not your average block placer. We're talking a wild mix of city building, survival, and physics all rolled into one. It's called All Will Fall, and the developers dropped a playtest right alongside the announcement of the game. We happened to grab an invite, and let me tell you, we've been hooked. Let's deep dive into this game, check out what makes it tick, and share everything we know about its upcoming release. From the moment you set foot in this game, it throws you right into the deep end. Quite literally, your ship will crash into some sunken wreckage and it immerses you immediately in this post-apocalyptic sunken world where the sea has basically risen and swallowed everything. The landscape is basically a massive ocean dotted with these random ruins, which luckily are packed with resources and stuff to scavenge. You are not here by yourself though. You've got a whole colony of people relying on you, so you've got to manage those people, manage your resources, and build a city from scratch. No pressure, right? So to start off the game, you really need to look after your people first, which means food and water, and that is essentially what you need to scavenge first. After that, you do have other resources like wood, junk, and metal, which are used in a lot of your building projects. Now, it does get a little bit tricky because the ship that you crash land with is totally destroyed. So you can harvest the resources from it, but you cannot use it to travel between the sunken wreckages. So instead, you've got to use the scavenged resources to build bridges and supports to be able to get to the different parts of the sea. Now, this is where things get really interesting because you can't just slap stuff together willy-nilly. You've actually got to think about how you're building things and make sure everything is supported properly, or all of your buildings will fall into the sea. The smaller gaps between some of the wreckages that you're navigating to aren't too bad, and usually you can get away with just building a walkway and it's no big deal. But once you get to the larger gaps, that's where you really need to start being mindful and making sure that your walkways and your buildings are adequately supported, or otherwise they literally will just fall into the ocean. Now, it can get interesting because there's not a whole lot of guidance in this playtest as to how to do it in an appropriate way. So it is a little bit of trial and error, but it is really fun figuring out how to best support things and just how far you can push your structures before gravity swallows them whole. There are tons of different buildings that you can unlock, like greenhouses to grow food, docks for ships that you can then send out to scavenge even more resources, and there are really a bunch of different ways to get your hands on the resources, which is really interesting. Now, of course, there is a research tree because what is a city builder without one? This one lets you unlock things like renewable resources, but it also has some moral dilemmas that you'll need to navigate. You can burn wood, boil water to make it drinkable, but you'll also be polluting the environment if you do that. A lot of the research options have this kind of pick your poison vibe where you really need to decide what's going to be best for the environment as well as what's going to be best for your colony, which really does highlight the post-apocalyptic world that you're living in and how those things might actually affect things like the sea levels and other weather conditions. You really do get to decide what type of leader you'll be, and not just in research, but also with your colony. There's lots of random events that occur throughout your everyday colony life. So there's things like a random ship might float by and you get to decide whether you want to take the people in or just steal all of their resources and leave them to float in the middle of the ocean. You also have things like uprisings of your people or people not being happy with some of your decisions. And each of these scenarios has different decisions with different consequences. So you do really need to think about what you're doing and what type of leader you want to be. Now, it's not quite as hectic as Frostpunk, for example, but it definitely has that same feeling of making these moral calls while trying to survive in a kind of messed up world. The colony management itself feels really hands-on. It's very individually based, so you're assigning individual people to specific tasks and you really feel like you're actually in charge. It's not like one of those top-down colony sims where you just give general orders and it kind of solves itself. You're right in the thick of it, which it's really nice if you love that hands-on aspect. If you thought managing resources, buildings, and people was enough to keep you busy, you were right, but there's more. So you also have to wrestle with the weather in this game. So the tides change. You'll get high tide, you'll get low tide, and you'll kind of get like this mid tide. And each of these different conditions brings with it a different set of challenges. So high tide will mean that your boats are stuck, so they can't collect any resources while it's high tide, and some of the lower levels will actually be flooded. So you need to make sure your people can get out before the high tide hits. Low tide will reveal new resources on those lower levels, but you do need to be quick about grabbing them because the water can come back in and then your people will potentially drown if you don't get them out quick enough. So this weather adds a whole other layer of strategy and timing to the game, and it really gives some variation to the day-night cycle of the game, because not only do you have day and night, but you also have high tide, low tide, mid-tide, and as you play, the water levels will rise and drop depending on the environmental impact. The weather was definitely one of the more interesting elements to the game, and I'm really interested to see how it's going to play out in the full version and whether or not we'll see more bigger weather events that have different effects too. The devs have hinted at more locations and buildings in the full game, which is really exciting. I'm guessing from what we have that we'll see some kind of multi-location setup, so you'll be able to have different settlements across different landscapes, which will be a cool way to manage different colonies. Now, all of this is based on the playtest, but even with just that, it's clear there's a ton of potential in this game. The playtest only gave us one level and one kind of environment, which was a little bit limiting, but even then, I found myself playing this game for hours and going away thinking about how I wanted to go back and do things differently, or research something else, or try something else. So it really has that draw that captures you. Even though it's early days, I'm actually really impressed with Overfall. It combines all of the best bits of city builders and colony sims, but also with a physics twist and a survival twist. It kind of feels like a mix of Frostpunk and Raft, but without Raft's super hands-on resource gathering, and without Frostpunk's freezing cold and really intense moral dilemmas. It's definitely one to keep an eye on, with the game currently planned for release in 2025. And if the playtest is anything to go on, I think they're definitely on the right track. The playtest has been extended until the 10th of February, so if you're watching this before that, you can head over to Steam right now and jump in and see if you like it yourself. But otherwise, this is definitely one to add to your wish list and keep an eye on for a really interesting city builder experience. That's where we're going to wrap up this video. If you're looking for more indie game recommendations, click here. And until next time, stay caffeinated.